My name is Madison, and I arrived in this world as a surprise. My parents were over 40 and already had a 10-year-old daughter whom they considered more than enough. We didn't plan you, my mom used to tell me, not with malice, but as someone might comment on the weather. If it hadn't been for my grandparents' insistence, she would have remained silent, but the message was clear. I was here because my maternal grandparents had convinced my parents, who didn't want any more children. My grandparents were thrilled with the idea of a second granddaughter, while my parents saw me as a responsibility they hadn't asked for. My sister Sarah was already immersed in her own world of teenage concerns when I arrived. She wasn't cruel or mean to me, she simply ignored me. While I played with my dolls in a corner of the living room, she'd be sprawled on the sofa, talking on the phone about boys and college applications, completely oblivious to my presence. "Sarah, Kareem, don't forget to prepare for the SAT." My mom would remind her, carefully arranging books in her backpack. Meanwhile, I'd sit at the kitchen table, hoping someone would notice I needed help with my homework. But that help rarely came from my parents. Instead, they developed a routine that marked my entire childhood. Each morning, they'd drop me off at my grandparents' house. "You wanted her," my dad would say to my grandpa, jingling his keys as he prepared to leave for work. "She's all yours," he'd add. My grandparents' house became my true home. They picked me up from school, helped me with my homework, took me to the park, and made sure I was well fed and cared for. Only late at night would my parents come to retrieve me, generally looking tired and slightly annoyed at having to make the trip. "Madison," my grandmother would say every night as she hugged me, "you are the best thing that has happened to us." And in those moments, enveloped in her warm embrace, I could almost forget I wasn't wanted anywhere else. This pattern continued day after day, year after year. While my sister prepared for her bright future, I learned to navigate life as an afterthought in my own home. But my grandparents' love was constant and unwavering. It was in their house that I learned what it meant to be truly valued. One day, as my grandfather helped me with math homework, he said, "You'll understand. Sometimes the best things in life aren't planned." He winked at me, and for a moment, the weight of being unwanted lifted from my small shoulders. When Sarah left for college, I thought things might change at home, that maybe my parents would finally see me. I figured it would just be me left at home. I was very wrong. "Madison," I heard my mom's voice before I could even drop my backpack after school. "The house needs cleaning. Start with the bathrooms." What were once Sarah's chores now became mine, along with many new responsibilities. The washing machine became my constant companion. I learned all its settings and quirks by heart. The housework seemed endless. "You live here, you have to contribute," my dad would tell me whenever I showed the slightest hesitation. "Your sister always did her part." When I turned 14, I graduated from cleaning to cooking. It wasn't a gradual transition. One day, my mom simply stopped making dinner. "You're old enough," she told me one morning. "We expect dinner to be ready when we get home from work." That first night, I made spaghetti. It was a bit overcooked, but at least edible. My parents ate in silence until my dad looked up from his plate and said, "Tomorrow, try something with chicken." His tone made it clear it wasn't a suggestion. My only escape was dreaming of college. Every night, after washing the dishes, I'd go to my room and browse university websites. I imagined myself walking across different campuses, far from the endless chores and cold silences. But when I was 16, Sarah came home with news that changed everything. It was a Sunday afternoon. Sarah burst through the front door, dragging a tall, well-dressed man behind her. "Mom, Dad," she shrieked. "This is James. We're engaged." You'd think someone had just announced they'd won the lottery. My parents literally jumped out of their seats. My mom cried tears of joy while my dad was already pulling out his phone to call relatives. "We'll pay for everything," my mom declared, hugging Sarah. "Our first daughter's wedding has to be perfect." Wedding preparations consumed our house for months. Every conversation revolved around flowers, dresses, and guest lists. Money seemed to flow like water. Designer dresses, top-tier caterers, everything premium. My grandparents attended the wedding but looked uncomfortable with the extravagance. I saw my grandmother frown at the ice sculpture that probably cost more than a semester of college tuition. My grandfather just shook his head at the sight of the champagne fountain. But both kept their thoughts to themselves. 2 years later, I sat at the dinner table with 3 college acceptance letters in front of me. After years of playing Cinderella and maintaining excellent grades, I'd been accepted to all my top choices. My heart raced as I told my parents the good news. "That's nice," my mom said, not looking up from her plate. "But we can't afford it. We spent all our savings on your sister's wedding. We even took out a loan. There's nothing left for college." "But you paid for Sarah's college," I stammered. "That was different," my mom replied. "We saw potential in her." The silence at the table was deafening after her words. I sat there, the acceptance letters in my hand suddenly feeling heavy, while my parents continued eating as if they hadn't just shattered my dreams. "You should get a job," my dad said between bites. "Save some money. Take out a student loan. That's what responsible adults do." I stood up from the table without asking permission, something I'd never dared to do before. Hands shaking, I grabbed my phone and called my grandmother. Within minutes, I was walking through her door, tears streaming down my face. "Oh, honey," my grandmother said, embracing me as I sobbed out the whole story. My grandfather's face grew serious as he listened, but there was a glint in his eyes I couldn't quite understand. When I finished speaking, my grandparents exchanged a knowing look. "Madison," my grandfather said, taking my hand, "we were expecting something like this." "What do you mean you were expecting it? You've seen how they've treated me all these years," I asked. My grandmother explained how they'd spent all the money on Sarah's education and wedding. "We knew they might do this to you," my grandfather said. He stood up and went to his study. When he returned, he held a folder. "We've been saving for your education since the day you were born," he said, opening it to reveal bank statements. "You can choose any of those 3 universities. We've got you covered." That night, I went back home and started packing my things, just the essentials. My parents were watching TV downstairs and barely looked up when I told them I was moving in with my grandparents. "Whatever you think is best," my mom said, without taking her eyes off the screen. It was relief I heard in her voice. The following weeks were a blur of college preparations. I decided to study financial analysis. Somehow, seeing my parents' mismanagement of money sparked my interest in doing things right. My grandparents helped me with every detail, from filling out forms to buying school supplies. When I finally started classes that fall, I felt like I'd stepped into a new world. The material was challenging, but I enjoyed every minute of every class. I felt like I was stepping away from my old life and into something better. My professors noticed my enthusiasm, and soon I was staying after class to discuss financial concepts. For the first time in my life, someone other than my grandparents saw potential in me, real potential. In my sophomore year of college, when my studies were in full swing, my grandmother called me with interesting news about Sarah. "Your sister is having some trouble," she said during one of our weekly calls. "Her marketing career isn't taking off the way she expected, and James can't seem to hold down a job. They keep asking your parents for money." I wasn't surprised when she told me they were moving back in. "Your mom emptied her retirement account last month to help them with the rent," my grandmother added. "They just can't say no to them." A year later, the situation worsened. Sarah and James could no longer afford rent, even with our parents' help. They moved back into my old room, the one I had kept impeccably clean for years. The irony wasn't lost on me. While I was thriving, my professors had helped me secure internships at prestigious financial firms, where I discovered I had a real talent for solving complex financial puzzles. Each challenging project made me more certain I'd chosen the right path. "You have a natural instinct for this," my supervisor at Morgan Stanley told me during my performance review. "We'd love to have you back next summer." I kept my head down and focused on my studies, barely thinking about my family except during calls with my grandparents. But when I visited them during my senior year, I knew something was wrong. The moment I walked in the door, my grandmother's usual warm smile seemed forced, and my grandfather, normally quick with a joke, sat silent in his armchair. The house felt heavy with unspoken words. "What's wrong?" I asked during dinner, watching them push food around their plates. "Don't tell me it's nothing. I know you too well." They exchanged a look I'd seen many times before, the one that meant they were trying to protect me from something. Finally, my grandfather spoke. "Your parents came to see us last week," he said, his voice unusually tired. They wanted their inheritance early. What do you mean? I asked, setting down my fork. They're in trouble with the banks, my grandmother explained. Multiple loans, credit card debt. They said they needed $200,000 to avoid bankruptcy. And you gave it to them, I added, unable to hide the anger in my voice. My grandfather nodded. We had to, Madison. They're still our daughter and son-in-law, despite everything. It was most of our savings, my grandmother continued. But the majority of your savings, I fumed. After all they'd done, they were still enabling Sarah's irresponsible behavior. After how they treated me. Honey, my grandmother reached across the table and took my hand. We know you're angry, but what's done is done. We'll be fine. But I was still angry. My parents, who never had money for my education and who treated me like a maid, had the audacity to demand money from the only people who truly cared about me because they couldn't say no to Sarah and couldn't manage their own finances. My hard work paid off. I graduated with enthusiastic recommendations from my professors and impressive internship experiences. I landed a position at one of the top financial firms in the city. The starting salary was more than I'd ever dreamed. I found a modest one-bedroom apartment, nothing special but clean and safe. Every morning, I woke up grateful I didn't have to make breakfast for anyone but myself. My career flourished as I threw myself into each new challenge, earning promotions and bonuses a younger me couldn't have imagined. Within a few years, I had enough saved for a down payment on my own house. The day I signed the mortgage papers, I couldn't help but think of my parents and Sarah, who'd never managed their money well enough to buy property. They didn't know about my success, though. We hadn't spoken in years. Until the call came that changed everything. My grandfather had suffered a massive heart attack. By the time I arrived at the hospital, he was already gone. My grandmother, who had been by his side for over 50 years, seemed to have lost her spark after that. Less than 2 months later, she followed him. I was arranging my grandmother's funeral when I heard a familiar voice behind me at the funeral home. Madison, do you want any help with the arrangements? I turned to find my mother standing there, looking older and more tired than I remembered. A part of me wanted to tell her to leave, but something in her expression made me hesitate. Sure, I heard myself say. That would be nice. Over the next few days, as we planned the service, my parents began to open up. They were struggling, they admitted. Retirement hadn't been kind to them financially. We barely make ends meet, my father confessed one afternoon as we picked out flowers. With Sarah's twins. Twins. This was news to me. Yes, 4-year-olds, my mother chimed in. Such beautiful boys. But they need a lot. Sarah and James still can't manage on their own. So we help where we can. I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. Some things never change. A week later, we were sitting in the lawyer's office for the reading of the will. I expected the usual, but what came next made everyone sit up straight. To our beloved granddaughter Madison, the lawyer read, we leave our house at 1542 Maple Street in the sum of $200,000. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah's mouth dropped open, and my mother gripped my father's arm so tightly her knuckles turned white. The lawyer cleared his throat and continued. And a personal note from Mr. Henderson to his daughter Margaret. He looked at my mother and read, Margaret, remember we gave you $200,000 when you needed it most. This is our final decision, and we trust you will respect it, just as we respected your needs. My mother's face flushed, then paled. My father stared at the floor while Sarah and James exchanged worried glances. After the lawyer finished and collected his papers, my parents approached me in the parking lot. The competent demeanor they displayed during the funeral preparations had vanished, replaced by something almost desperate. Madison, honey, my mother began, her voice trembling. You have to understand, we always thought we were counting on inheriting. We're struggling, my father added, running a hand through his graying hair. The mortgage, the expenses with Sarah's family. We could really use the house. I looked at them both, remembering all the years of neglect, the constant reminders that I wasn't wanted, the refusal to help with my education. No, I said firmly. The house is mine. That's what they'd wanted. Grandma and Grandpa. They continued pleading with me, even followed me to my car, but I held firm. Sarah joined the conversation, talking about how her kids needed a yard to play in. But I simply got in my car and drove away. A week later, my phone rang. It was my mother asking me to come for dinner. Something in her voice sounded different. Humbled, maybe. Against my better judgment, I agreed. Arriving at my childhood home was like stepping back in time, except everything seemed more worn down than I remembered. The paint was peeling, the gutter sagged, and the once pristine lawn was now patchy and overgrown. Inside, the house was cluttered but clean. Sarah's twins, Tommy and Jake, ran in circles around the living room while James half-heartedly told them to calm down. They were cute. They had Sarah's eyes and James's curly hair. Madison. My mother smiled and pulled me into an awkward hug. We made your favorite pot roast. That's not my favorite, I said automatically. That's Sarah's favorite. An awkward silence followed, broken by my father clearing his throat. Well, why don't you tell us what your favorite is? We'd love to know. And surprisingly, they seemed genuinely interested. During dinner, they asked me about my job, my apartment, my hobbies. They actually listened when I talked about my work in finance, though I could tell most of it went over their heads. That dinner led to another, and then another, and soon I was joining them for holidays, bringing gifts for the twins, even helping Sarah with their homework. Sometimes, when they mentioned the house needing repairs, I offered to help. I paid for a new roof, fixed the heating system, repainted the exterior. Each time I wrote a check, my parents cried tears of gratitude. You're too good to us, my mother would say, hugging me. We don't deserve this. You're right, I think. But I never said it out loud. Despite everything, despite all the years of hurt and neglect, a small part of me still wanted to believe people could change. Years passed, and my career continued to flourish. Each year brought new opportunities, and my investment portfolio grew substantially. Meanwhile, my relationship with my parents seemed to strengthen. They were getting older, both in their 70s now, and I found myself wanting to do something significant for them. I've been thinking, I said during one of our Sunday dinners, watching my father struggle to get out of his chair. This house isn't really suitable for you anymore. I want to buy you a new one. Something single-story with a nice yard, but easier to maintain. Something comfortable for your retirement years. Their reaction surprised me. Actual tears of joy. We spent the next few weeks house hunting together. I finally found the perfect place. A beautiful ranch-style home in a quiet neighborhood, with wide doorways and no stairs. After closing on the deal, my parents couldn't stop talking about how thrilled they were. When we get together to have a housewarming party, my father declared, let us arrange everything. It's the least we can do. That would be wonderful, I agreed, planning to present them with the deed during the celebration. Just let me know when. Weeks passed. I was busy with work, but kept waiting for an invitation. When nothing came, I started asking about the date. Oh, we're still planning, my mother would say. You know these things take time. We want it to be perfect. We'll let you know soon, my father would add, equally vague. Their evasive answers bothered me. One night, after another deflected phone call from my mother, I found myself looking up Sarah's Facebook profile. I hadn't looked at her profile in years. We weren't connected on any social media. There it was, posted just a few hours earlier. So excited for Mom and Dad's housewarming party this Saturday. The house is gorgeous. Can't wait to celebrate with everyone. The post had dozens of comments from relatives and friends, all confirming their attendance. Photos showed decorations being set up, catering already booked. This wasn't a last-minute gathering. It had been planned for weeks. My hand trembled slightly. I called my mother. Hi, Mom. I kept my voice casual. Just checking about the housewarming party. Did you set a date yet? Oh, honey, she replied smoothly. Not yet. Probably in a couple of weeks. We're still working out the details. We want everyone to be able to come. Everyone but me, apparently. That Saturday, I parked my car a block away from the house. Music and laughter drifted through the large front windows on the evening air. I could see dozens of people inside. My parents' friends, Sarah's friends, relatives, everyone in their social circle. The front door was wide open. They were expecting everyone, of course, except the person who actually owned the house. I walked in quietly, following the sound of my father's voice to the living room. After all these years of hard work, we finally did it. He was telling a group of attentive listeners. We bought our dream house. Don't forget about Sarah, my mother added proudly. She helped so much with the down payment. Such a wonderful daughter, always looking after her parents. Unlike some people, someone commented. You know, my mother said pointedly, our youngest hasn't helped us at all. Probably too busy with her career to care about family. I stood in the doorway, heat rising to my face as I watched this performance. Sarah beamed beside them, her now 7-year-old twins running between the guests in the house I bought. Actually, I said loudly, making everyone jump, I think you have that backward. The color drained from my parents' faces. The guests turned to stare at me, whispers rippling through the crowd. Madison, my father was the first to recover his composure, though his smile was strained. What a surprise. I'm sure it is, I replied, stepping into the room. Especially since you forgot to invite me to the housewarming party for the house I bought. Dead silence fell over the room. Sarah's husband suddenly became very interested in his shoes. Well, my mother said, her tone implying she was above arguing. It's done now. You bought it. Yes, but now it's ours. You can't expect us to give you eternal gratitude, my father said, gaining some confidence. And frankly, you're not welcome here. This is a family gathering, and Sarah and her family will be living here too, my mother announced. They'd already sold their house, she added. It was all arranged. I couldn't help but laugh, a cold, harsh sound that made several guests step back. I reached into my purse and pulled out a folder. It seems there's something you don't understand, I said, opening the folder to display the deed and ownership documents. This house belongs to me. I never signed it over to you. I was planning to give it to you tonight, at what I thought would be a proper housewarming party. My mother's face went from pale to ashen. My father started to splutter. And now, I turned to address the stunned guests. I'd like everyone to leave. This is my house and this is where it ends. You can't do this. My mother's voice rose to a shriek. We're your parents. No, I said quietly. You're just the people who gave birth to me. My real parents, my grandparents, taught me that family means more than blood. They also taught me about finances. That's why I own this house and you don't. I left them there weeping, my parents, Sarah, James, the twins, and all their guests. I watched from the front porch as they drove away one by one, until the street was empty. A few weeks later, I learned they'd used the money from the sale of their own house to buy a condo, where Sarah, James, and the twins moved in. They tried calling me for weeks, but I blocked their numbers, their emails, their social media accounts. I sold the house a month later and put the money in my account. Someday I'll have my own children. And I promise myself they will never have to earn my love or compete for my attention. Unlike my parents, I will love them equally and unconditionally, just as my grandparents loved me.